welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody who watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I thought the episode went quite well. So yeah, good week. This week's episode of the show comes to you from a rather hot study, and I mean that hot as in temperature. And yeah, if you can hear a bit of a whirring in the background, then no, that's not a problem with the sound. It is my portable air conditioning unit, otherwise known as a small fan. Yes, what does that say about the show? I have small fans. No. Anyway, so yeah, it's keeping my armpit nice and cool, but nothing else. Anyway, okay, so this week's episode of the show. I've had this episode, or this set of samples actually, sort of sat on my desk pretty much right there for months and months, and I've been looking at them and thinking I really should do an episode of the show on them, because I've never done an episode of the show on Bundaberg Rum, and I think it might be a bit fun. Oh, it's not available in the UK, obviously, because Bundaberg is an Australian rum. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? You know, when you think about rum production, you automatically think about the sort of the Caribbean, Central and South America, that kind of thing. Australia is not a country that actually sort of springs to mind as a rum producing powerhouse, shall we say? But they do indeed, I believe, grow sugar cane down there, so it stands to reason, I suppose. I mean, and also at the end of the day, when you think about it, I mean, obviously we make rum here in the UK. Rum is made from, you know, predominantly from molasses, which is a byproduct of the sugar industry, which, you know, you can buy. You don't actually have to these days, you know, have a sugar plantation on your doorstep to make rum, you know. So so yeah, anyway, so I thought, you know, Bundaberg, or Bundies as it seems to be colloquially known in Australia, which brings to mind sort of, you know, today's title. It's actually quite weird because I normally never kind of think of a title for the episode of the show, not until I've actually started editing it. It's very rare that I actually come up with one beforehand, but you know, it's just sort of like, well, are we talking Al or are we talking Ted? Clever? No? Okay, fine. Anyway, I'll forget the comedy and I'll stick to doing what I do best, I think. Anyway, so Bundaberg, yeah, it's actually been in existence for a considerable long time, about 122 years. Founded in 1888, started production in 1889, and I found quite a nice website with quite an in-depth history of the distillery, and it basically said it's the epitome of the Aussie battler, apparently. The company has seen its fair share of adversity over its 122 years history. It has survived droughts, insolvency, a distillery fire, the Great Wall, the temperance movement, the Great Depression, another fire, World War II, and being sold to the Poms. Yeah, as it said, quite frankly, the Bundaberg Distillery Company was built by blokes that were as tough as nails. And I suppose you probably have to be to live in Australia, don't you? What with all the adversity, shall we say. But anyway, so yeah, built in 1888, and not long after it had actually been in production, due to the 1890s depression in Australia, it got into financial difficulties, went into liquidation, and was basically saved by three of the founding members of the board, who basically sort of took on the debt and sort of resurrected the company. So yeah, without those, you know, well, I wouldn't quite go as far as saying philanthropic vision. You know, the distillery would have probably disappeared not long after it started. But like I said, it's been through quite a number of things. So there was a fire in 1907, which took quite a considerable amount of the distillery, and when the fire brigade turned up, found there was no water on site. Okay, The Great War, obviously, in 1914 hampered it, although it didn't hamper its production, but it hampered its sales, because basically everything that was produced was commandeered by the Australian Navy, and then the British Royal Navy basically nicked the rest. Well, they probably didn't nick the rest, but they probably bought it, but that was basically, I can't imagine they paid top dollar, shall we say. Obviously, the 1920s were quite successful time for the distilleries, and then along came the Depression of the 30s, which kind of kicked it in the nuts. And it's quite interesting, according to the history that I found here, that Australia was actually one of the hardest hit countries during the 1930s depression, and by 1932 had an unemployment rate of 29%. That's pretty big. Anyway, but of course the distillery seemed to sort of outlast that, and carried on sort of production. Interestingly enough, the distillery itself didn't actually start bottling its own rum until mid 1970s. Prior to that, everything was sold off in cask or in bulk, it had a number of companies that had the sole distribution rights to its sales, and certainly one company called Australian Rum Distillers Pty Limited had the rights to sell outside of Queensland. Obviously the distillery is situated in Bundaberg in Queensland, and it was them, a chap called Sam Mahone, that came up with the idea of the square bottle and the polar bear logo. Now, polar bear, apparently it was the reasoning behind using a polar bear was that it implied it was a drink that could ward off the wickedest chill, apparently. Fine, okay, can live with that. The one thing I can't quite get my head around and live with is the actual distillery itself. Looking at pictures, it's got this immense bottle. God only knows what it's made from, but outside the distillery, I mean, it looks like a bloody Disneyland, for God's sake. I mean, it really does look like a bloody pastiche. I mean, you look at it and you can't see anything of a rum distillery. There's no nasty bits or anything like that. It's all very corporate or very nice, well, yeah, if you like that kind of Disney kind of thing, then all well and good. Anyway, coming back to sort of more current times, the distillery and the company was sold to good old Diageo in 2000. They subsequently decided, in their usual manner, that they were going to basically move the bottling from Bundaberg to somewhere else, Huntingwood, apparently. I'm not entirely sure where that is. Western Sydney, apparently, which pissed off an awful lot of people because it took jobs away from the Bundaberg area, and apparently the premier of some chap called Campbell Newman of Queensland said it was a disappointing move. I like this bit. And he said, "I'm saddened by the announcement, but I have been assured that the company had a commitment to the city. I understood demand for a bottled Bundaberg rum had declined as more people bought pre-mixed cans. A trend I wanted no part of." Good on him. I mean, dear God, pre-mixed bloody cans of rum and coke. I mean, oh, come on, I mean... And bizarrely, although Diageo is a UK company, and I read that there was some kind of bollocks basically about the rum becoming sort of a worldwide success, you can't buy it in the UK. There is actually a Australian website that will sell it to the UK, and but it's not actually, as far as I'm aware, available in the UK. Certainly, I mean. And it just kind of just highlights the fact that I really don't think Diageo know what the hell they're doing, to be bluntly honest with you. I mean, they're supposedly sort of, a very corporate, swish, sort of profitable company, but you've got something on your portfolio that you're not distributing worldwide? Anyway, that's not for me to question. For me to question is the juice in the bottle, as per usual. Now, the problem is that I don't have a sample of their bog standard stuff, so I can't sort of, I've got a selection of samples which I'll obviously go through, which came from the Rum Awards, one when I was judging into the 2015 Rum Awards and this year's World Rum Awards. So this is generally, when I'm judging competitions, is when I tend to come across a lot of these kind of weird and wonderful, interesting spirits, and so I've only got a selection of their range, a snapshot. So, you know, I'm hoping this kind of gives a sort of an idea of the style of Bundaberg rum, the quality, that kind of thing. But like I said, bear in mind this is kind of like just a snapshot, not the entire range. So anyway, I think that's enough waffling. My armpit is nice and chilly, but my throat is getting a little bit dry, so I think it's time to introduce the lineup and taste some rum. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with the same bottling. I've got two samples of the same bottling. This is the Master Distillers Collection Small Batch Reserve, bottled at 40%. First sample was entered into the 2015 World Rum Awards, so I'm going to assume that was probably bottled sometime 2013, 2014. Apparently, it is a blend of Bundaberg rums, assuming some that have been made, or a majority aged in ex-American oak, blended with aged reserves matured in brandy and cognac barrels. Now, interestingly enough, when I wrote my notes and tasted it a second time for this particular bottling, which was this year's World Rum Awards, obviously all I get to know is that's all I get. I get pot, column still, ABV. That's all I get. Don't get any other information, and it tasted to me and smelt to me like it had been finished, or there was virgin oak or something like that. So when I looked it up for today's episode of the show and discovered that it was indeed, you know, finished, or should we say a proportion was finished, I thought, well, seem to know what I'm talking about, I suppose. Anyway, bottling number 3 is a limited edition bottling from 2014. This was the Master Distillers Collection 280, bottled at 40%. Apparently, this was 280 ex-Kentucky American whiskey casks, which were filled with 7-year-old rum. Don't know how much longer they were actually aged for once that 7-year-old rum was put in the cask, but there you go. So 7-year-old rum, essentially finished in, I would imagine, first fill ex-Tennessee whiskey barrels, or American whiskey barrels as the case may be. Next bottling we're moving on to is the 2014 Blenders edition. This is bottled again at 40%, which is a real disappointment. I mean, you know, you would have thought, well, no, they're some bloody Diageo, and they're you know, well, heads in the past anyway, so not a surprise that you know, we've got 40% across the board, is it? So yeah, let's just dig Diageo a bit more. Why not? That's what large corporations are there for, aren't they? Anyway, so yeah, 2014 Blenders edition, bottled at 40%. Finished in ex-port and ex-sherry casks. And the final bottling of the day is the Master Distillers Collection Small Batch Distillery Edition Coconut Reserve. That's a hell of a mouthful, isn't it? This, bizarrely, is bottled at 43%. And according to the blurb, the second expression in the Small Batch Distillers Edition series has been expertly crafted by filtering hand-selected 16-year-old rum reserves through coconut shell charcoal to develop notes of chocolate, vanilla, brown sugar and toasted coconut. 16-year-old rum? Why? Okay, fine. Obviously not going to sort of draw any conclusions to it until I've actually physically tasted it, but okay, chocolate, vanilla, brown sugar, toasted coconut. Well, I like coconut. So yeah, I think that'll be an interesting one to finish on, don't you? Anyway, like I said, now I think that is definitely enough talking, and time for some tasting. Right, okay, so we're looking at the Master Distillers Collection Small Batch Reserve. So like I said, this probably came from 2013, 2014. I always like to taste batches because, you know, we will find out whether there is some batch variation, and if there is, how sort of noticeable that variation is. Okay, it's quite high tone. Now, in all my digging, I couldn't actually find out any information about what stills the distillery has. I'm going to assume probably column and pot. This certainly smells like a lot of column still. It's got that high-toned, dried fruit, sort of column still character. It's that lighter, you could say elegant. It's got that sort of juicy sultana, sort of dried apricot, lighter end of the dried fruit spectrum. A little bit of date, a little bit of wood spice, a little bit of sweetness. There's a bit of a dustiness. I mean, yeah, okay, possibly I can get maybe a little bit of a cognac-y kind of note. I can see that sort of slightly taut French oak and a little bit of sort of dried apple, maybe. Touch of sugar, touch of brown sugar. I mean, it's a pleasant nose. I wouldn't say it's the most complex of noses on the planet. Now I forget what I did mention there was that Australian website that does sell this to the UK, and I can't remember what it was now. I'm pretty certain this was something like about 70 quid, 65 quid, something like that. Yeah, a bit expensive, and I imagine you have to add on delivery as well if you wanted a bottle. But yeah, okay, it's pleasant. See what the palate like. It's a bit cloyingly sweet on the finish. I wonder whether that's sweetened post distillation, because that is really quite sweet. Quite nutty, straightforward, simple. Again, get the impression of column still dried fruit. I did read some, shall we say, somewhat less than enthusiastic reviews of this particular bottling, it has to be said. Well, they were, shall we say, a little bit more cutting. I think it is what it is. I mean, it's not really worth 60 odd quid, to be bluntly honest with you. I mean, I don't know what it retails for in Australia. I mean, I would imagine. I mean, I know this is not their basic bog standard bottling. This is obviously, being a small batch, this is kind of like your next rung up. It's just a bit simple, really, at the end of the day. I would like, given what they've done to it, what the finishing, the reserves and what have you that they've blended in, didn't really come across as with a particular great deal of age, and like I said, fairly simple, but you know, it's pleasant. Right, okay, so let's move on to the other bottle of the small batch. So like I said, I'm guessing this is probably closer to have been bottled last year to 2020, something like that, I would have thought. Now this nose is slightly darker, more burnt wood, toast, black licorice, molasses, more. I'm certainly getting that lighter column still element, but it seems to have some pot still weight to it now. Again, possibly a little bit more complex because I'm getting some what appears to be pot still character. There's a little bit of citrus. It's got a slight kind of, almost kind of Guyanan, oily, sort of edgy note there happening on, just, you know, slightly there. Yeah, I think this is a better bottling. It seems it's less simple, although the nose is still, the nose on the previous batch was actually relatively complex. I prefer this nose. I think it's got more character. Let's see what the pals are. A lot woodier, still quite sweet, but there's more kind of molasses, sort of treacle sweetness notes. Toffee, vanilla, again a little bit of burnt wood, little bit of sort of, I can see the cognac-y kind of notes now. It's certainly kind of got French oak. It's got that slight tautness, that slight tannic tautness on the mid palate and on the finish. And it kind of, it is a bit sweet. I feel it on my mouth, on my lips, and I don't think that's a natural sweetness, it has to be said. And sort of obviously knowing Diageo and their love of using E150 and additives, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. Okay, got no problem with that. I know there are. When it comes to whiskey, I am sort of, you know, a traditionalist. When it comes to rum, I kind of go with the flow a little bit, you know. I don't mind if you want to chuck a load of sugar in your rum, as long as it doesn't overly impact the character. I think in this instance it probably does. It's a little bit too sweet, and you know, as a lot of people have an issue with the sort of the lack of transparency. I don't know whether, like I said, I don't know whether they artificially sweeten. I think they do from the from tasting it, and if they do, I don't know whether they actually claim they do. Being a Diageo owned company, I imagine they probably don't. But anyway, it is what it is, isn't it? Right, okay, so let's move on to the Distillers Collection 280. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? I can smell that American oak. Although it's not, it is really creamy, it's chocolatey. It's got some maturity. There's a slight saline-y kind of note coming through. Some licorice. It's perfumed. Not quite as sweet. Is quite oaky, but soft. I'd like to see a little bit more spice there, you know, just kind of something to just balance it up a little bit more. I mean, it's an impressive nose. It's a lovely, soft, vanilla-y, chocolatey nose with some subtle rumminess, it has to be said. I can see why people would sort of instantaneously get into this, because it is one of those kind of crowd pleasing noses. But then you kind of pick it apart and you think, well, yeah, there's kind of things that are, yeah, there's a little, like I said, a little bit of a herbal saline kind of note, but not enough of something other, like a bit of a spice or something to kind of just offset. But you know, it's pleasant. It's not an unpleasant nose. Let's see what the parts like. Broad, juicy, sort of Jamaican-ish, I guess, with that lovely broad, juicy, dried fruit. Again, strikes me as more column still. We've got that slightly higher tone character, not quite so intrusive oak. Oak kind of really only comes through on the mid palate, and it's a bit fleeting, and it's not as sweet. There's definitely a sweetness there, but it's more vanilla sweetness as opposed to a sugar sweetness. I mean, there is a sort of little bit of dark brown sugar, some dried fruit. It's got a pleasant length. It's, again, it lacks a bit of spice or just something there just to basically counterbalance that oak character. It is nice, but there is just something lacking, and it's weird that, you know, rums from, I very rarely find a rum from outside of the Caribbean that I just go, yeah, that's absolutely stunning. I mean, I don't know what it is. Is it my mindset? Is it the fact that, you know, the Caribbean makes rum better than everywhere else? I don't know. I mean, certainly, you know, Bundaberg has been making rum for long enough to sort of be able to get it right. But this is obviously the style they've chosen. This is obviously the style that the home market obviously enjoys. I mean, we're not talking about a small company here. I mean, you know, Bundaberg is, or Bundy is pretty damn big. I mean, it sponsors practically everything, you know, from rugby through to God knows what else. And, you know, just the list of Bundy products that you can buy, you know, from glasses and through to bikinis. I mean, it's frightening. But yeah, so obviously what they're making is for the Australian market, and okay. Okay, so let's move on to the Blenders Edition 2014. So export next sherry certainly has an obvious darker colour when you sort of compare it. I don't know whether you can really sort of see that. Hopefully you can. So this is obviously highlighting the fact that the casks would appear to be adding at least quite a substantial amount of colour. Can't get caramel. It's caramelised. Whether that's all natural, it's not damped. So if there is some E150, and well, like I said, you know, Diageo is well renowned for the use of it, it's not overly impinging. Again, highest toned, column still, green fruit, intriguing, treacle, burnt wood, a little bit of herbs. Again, actually not a bad nose. There's a little bit of sort of, I get kind of porty astringency. I don't really get porty fruit. There's no real kind of black fruit, but there is this kind of almost saline astringency, sort of, you know, winey astringency. A little bit of sherry cask, possibly. I mean, okay, that's an intriguing, interesting nose. So the pulse line. Now that is a little bit on the flat side, it has to be said. Treacle, molasses, a little bit of dried fruit, a little bit of high tone column still note, but it really feels like it's been flattened down, and I'm going to put my neck on the block and say that there has indeed been some caramel used in this, because it's just, it's got a lilt at the end, it's got a citric sort of lift right on the finish, but there's that kind of dampening feeling and slight burnt caramel note that kind of comes through. Actually, I get quite a lot of porty fruit on the aftertaste, lots of black fruit. I'm going to say this could have been a lot more than what it actually is, and like I said, I think that the use of caramel here has probably been detrimental to the overall product. But so yeah, if you'd have stripped out the E150 and left that well alone, it may well have been considerably better, I think. Right, okay, so moving on to the final bottling of the afternoon. This is the small batch Distillery edition Coconut Reserve. So filtered through coconut shell charcoal. Let's see what the nose gives us on this thing, shall we? Woody coconut, and lots of it, and chocolate, and pineapple, and raisin, and brown sugar. Well, they were right about that, it has to be said. It's really nutty, it's tropical fruit and nut mix, it's confected as hell, it has to be said. Yeah. Again, it just lacks something. It lacks some spice, maybe some bitterness. It's kind of sweet and coconutty and chocolatey and vanilled and brown sugar, and why in God's name you use 16-year-old rum? I have no idea, because I'm not really getting a great deal of rum character. Yeah, I mean, it's got a nice weight to it, I will give it that. So we'll pass one. Weighty, woody, charcoaly, coconutty. Rather one-dimensional, has to be said. I mean, again, if there was just something to balance up that sweetness, it's not an unnatural sweetness. I don't think they've used any caramel here, thank God. And it is what it is at the end of the day. It's a sort of product that, you know, you're either going to love or you're going to hate. I mean, I think the quality is pretty good. It's not my kind of thing, it has to be said. I think it could have been improved. I mean, hark at me, you know, you know. But that's my personal feeling, and yeah, it's fine. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, like I said, this is not really this is a snapshot of Bundaberg. It's certainly not, you know, a kind of a real in-depth look at the range. Would like to have seen or had a sample of their sort of their standard bottling. That would have been a really nice comparison. But I didn't, so I've kind of got to work with what I've got to work with. And overall, if I'm going to sum it up, it's a very commercial style. It's relatively sweet. It's easygoing. I wouldn't quite go as far as saying it's the Jack Daniels of the rum world, but you know, we're kind of that kind of territory, to be bluntly honest with you. And I would imagine that the bog standard bottling is probably pretty sweet and sort of really just for mixing with Coke. Anyway, so the small batch reserve, yeah, okay, interesting. I think I preferred the later bottling. It had a little bit more complexity because I kind of got some kind of molasses and some kind of what felt like pot still weight. But overall, column still dried fruit seemed to be the thing. And bottling, the later bottling was slightly more woodier, and you know, I don't know. It's a kind of horses for courses, I suppose. You could argue that the earlier bottling had a little bit more elegance, possibly, whereas that elegance has been kind of lost by the sort of brashness, I suppose, of the later bottling. Kind of really sums up Australia, doesn't it? Sort of elegance, brashness, possibly. Oh, just insult an entire continent there. Yeah, so it's okay. It's not earth-shattering, and like I said, I think I prefer the later bottling. The Masters Distillers collection, again, you know, I think the whole theme of today's episode has been, it could have been so much more interesting than it actually was. Nice attempt. Got the Kentucky or the American oak, the sort of obvious kind of vanillans of the American oak. Just lacked something just to offset that. Some spices notes would have really been nice, but it just didn't seem to have that at the end of the day. So, same to a certain extent with the Blenders edition. Nose was probably more interesting than the palate. The palate was, shall we say, overly compromised by the use of caramel. Well, that's what it appears to me. No doubt Diageo would probably argue that it isn't. Well, they probably wouldn't actually, because they are quite, you know, happy to advocate the use of it and claim that it has nothing to do with the, you know, the flavour, or doesn't. I mean, I suppose if you're very judicious with it, then there's a possibility that you can get away with using caramel, but sometimes, you know, use a bit too much and it becomes somewhat obvious. And I think in this instance, I think a really interesting product was probably hampered by the use of caramel. And the Coconut Reserve, yeah, fine. It is what it is. Why use 16-year-old rum? I have no idea, because you can't really taste it. Yes, all right, it gives you a feeling of weight in it and substance, which maybe a younger rum wouldn't have done. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like, you know, chocolatey and coconutty, really. I mean, yeah, pleasant, like it, enjoy it. Don't see why you needed to use such a, you know, mature spirit and probably make it pretty expensive. Right, so now I've insulted Australia, I've insulted Bundaberg Distillery, I've insulted Diageo. I better basically say that anything I do say today are my own comments and does not have any bearing or relevance to the company employs me. So, you know, if you are offended by what I've said, then, you know, have a go at me, not the company that employs me. Yeah, I think it's been an honest appraisal. I don't think it's a bad product per se. I think it could be better than it actually is. But like I said, it is pretty much like Jack Daniel's. It's obviously playing to what the masses like, and obviously if it sells, you know, a considerable amount of rum, which I imagine it probably does, then obviously a lot of people like it. So, you know, you get, so the odd snob like me basically going, well, it's not very good really, is it? You know, they're going to basically go, well, who the fuck are you? You know, we sell shitloads of it, so what do we care? Well, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Is probably going to end up more controversial than I envisaged it being when I kind of started it. So I'll duck and avoid the brickbats. Anyway, until next week, I hope you have a good afternoon, good dramming, and good afternoon.